It's no secret that The Wizard of Oz is one of the most influential and well-regarded movies of all time. The classic story of a girl from Kansas whisked off to the magical land of Oz, and the colorful cast of characters she meets in her journey to return home. There's a lot that can be said about The Wizard of Oz, much of which has already been said in one way or another. After all, it's one of the most famous movies of all time, to the point where, even if you haven't seen the film yourself, you're most likely aware of the basic plot. However, when people discuss the subject of The Wizard of Oz as well as the art of cinema, what folks might not even know is that these two topics are actually far more intertwined than they might initially believe. When you bring up The Wizard of Oz to anyone, then 9 times out of 10 they are likely to think of this specific film, and given how famous the film is, that makes sense. But not only is it far from the only time this interpretation of this world has been displayed on the big screen, it wasn't even the first time someone tried to visualize such a unique story in film format. Seriously, the history of films that attempt adaptations of The Wizard of Oz is one that spans well over a century, with dozens of actors over the course of that time portraying these iconic characters in multiple different ways. As someone who occasionally gets way too interested in this sort of thing, it's a topic I want to discuss today, and so I sat myself down and went through the laundry list of all the different varieties of Wizard of Oz adaptations, and what I found is quite an interesting catalog of films, most of which I've never really heard anyone talk about before. So let's follow the yellow brick road and see where it leads us as we take a quick journey through the history of Wizard of Oz movies. Here's a fun drinking game. Take a shot every time I say the word Oz in this video. So for context, the original Wizard of Oz film released theatrically in the latter half of 1939. However, the origins of what would become the film actually date back to almost 40 years beforehand. Published in the year 1900, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was written by one L. Frank Baum, an American author who had already found some success in writing books aimed towards a younger audience. Wizard of Oz would prove to be the most successful work he ever made, and in the ensuing years he would write an additional 13 books in the Oz series. Now you'd think that with Baum's passing in 1919 that the series would naturally end with the final book he wrote, but that isn't quite the case. You see, despite the fact that Baum published 14 total novels in the Oz series, there is, in actuality, a grand total of 40 Wizard of Oz books. Okay, so in the first decade of the 1900s, Baum partnered with publishing company Riley and Lee, under which the Oz series would be published, along with all the other works he had going at the time. Following Baum's death, Riley and Lee would pass the series over to several different authors over the following decades, each of which would continue to flesh out the world Baum created, with the 40th and final book being completed in 1963. Now, yes, for the sake of clarity, there are, in totality, a lot more than these 40 specific books that take place in the Oz universe. Quite a number of them, in fact. However, generally speaking, the books written by L. Frank Baum and those employed by Riley and Lee are the ones considered to be the proper canonical books. So as you can see, even before we get around to the movie side of things, that's still a pretty decent amount of material ripe for adaptation. And from the sound of it, this is something Baum himself recognized, as only a couple years after the original book's publication, he was already attempting to produce a retelling of the story. But what's interesting is that this very first attempt at an adaptation of The Wizard of Oz wasn't even for the big screen. Rather, it was in the form of a musical, developed in 1902, with Baum himself putting a significant amount of work into the project. Now, I know that you're probably familiar with the plot of The Wizard of Oz. Even if you haven't seen the film, you probably have a general idea of what happens. But for the sake of getting us all on the same page, it is worth a brief summary, because even then, the original book does differ a bit from the 1930s film. Dorothy Gale is a young girl from Kansas who was one day caught in a violent cyclone, and, joined with her dog Toto, is whisked away along with her house to the magical land of Oz. Upon arrival, Dorothy accidentally crushes the Wicked Witch of the East with said house, and is given the witch's magical silver shoes. Dorothy's informed by the Good Witch of the North that her only chance of returning home is by traveling along the Yellow Brick Road to the Emerald City and meeting the powerful Wizard of Oz. Along her journey, Dorothy makes new friends, including a sentient scarecrow, a woodman made of tin, and a lion with anxiety issues. Upon arriving at the Emerald City, the wizard tells Dorothy and her gang that they must vanquish the vile Wicked Witch of the West, which Dorothy eventually does by throwing a bucket of water on her, causing the witch to melt. With the Wicked Witch defeated, the wizard is revealed to just be an ordinary guy from Nebraska. The wizard uses his hot air balloon to transport him and Dorothy home, but the balloon leaves before Dorothy can board it. Once again stranded, Dorothy is told that the Good Witch of the South has a means to transport her home, and Dorothy and her friends embark on another adventure to find the witch. Once Dorothy eventually locates the Good Witch of the South, she reveals that Dorothy's silver shoes have the power to take her wherever she wants. Dorothy uses the shoes to take her back to Kansas, winding up in the fields just outside her house. Now overall, the plot is pretty similar to the film version that you're probably the most familiar with, albeit with a few noticeable alterations. And so it makes it all the more interesting how the musical version, which, keep in mind, was overseen by the same guy who wrote the book, deviates by quite a bit. In the musical version, the general beats of the story play out in a relatively similar fashion, just with a few changes. Toto the dog, for instance, has been replaced with Imogen the cow, and instead of a pair of shoes, in this case the silver shoes, Dorothy is given a special ruby ring to wear. Where things really start to change is with the introduction of two new characters, a man named Pastoria and his girlfriend Trixie, the both of which were flung to Oz in the same tornado that scooped up Dorothy. Pastoria, it turns out, is actually the former King of Oz, who was dethroned by the wizard some time ago and is looking to regain his title. Dorothy still meets the Scarecrow and Tin Woodman in this version, although the lion is strangely absent for some reason. The group still travels to the Emerald City and meets the wizard. However, as they do so, Pastoria stages a coup on the city, arresting the wizard and marking Dorothy and her friends as enemies of the state due to their association with the wizard. In the musical's final act, Dorothy, the Scarecrow, and the Tin Woodman are all captured by Pastoria and set to be executed. Dorothy, at the last second, calls upon the Witch of the North, who saves them and sets them free. So yeah, it's quite a bit of a change from the original book. Now, L. Frank Baum was very much into the theater, so I think it makes sense that the first time he'd try to retell the Wizard of Oz story, it would be in the form of a musical. And this wouldn't be the first time he'd try something like this, as his next project, titled The Fairy Log and Radio Plays, would be, by technicality, the first time the Wizard of Oz would be adapted in the form of a film. The reason I say by technicality in this instance is mainly because The Fairy Log and Radio Plays wasn't 100% a movie. Rather, from what I've gathered, it was sort of a mix of theater performances with live actors, movie segments, and projection slides. It sounds like a pretty ambitious project, especially for the time, but unfortunately we don't really have any footage that actually shows what it would have looked like back in the day. All we have now are a couple of pictures taken of the actors in costume. Luckily, though, we do still have access to the first proper film adaptation of Baum's work, that being the 1910 silent film, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. Given that this is a movie from well over a century ago, at a time when filmmaking as an art form was still in its infancy, it's not much of a surprise to know that this is a fairly primitive way of adapting the material. Now, of course, I don't hold that against the film at all. I'm not expecting quality on par with a modern superhero film. I'm just saying it's important to manage your expectations with stuff like this. In terms of the film's plot, what we have here is an odd fusion between the original book and the additions the musical brought in. The story is still about Dorothy Gale and her experiences in Oz, and she still meets characters like the Scarecrow, Lion, and all the rest. Strangely, while Dorothy's pet dog Toto is included in this film, the dog's replacement from the musical, Imogen the cow, is also present, both of which, as you can see, are portrayed by some poor saps wearing decent enough looking Halloween costumes. The Wicked Witch of the West is absent from the film, instead being replaced by the fairly similar character of Mamba the Witch. In the end, though, she still perishes the same way as her counterpart when Dorothy tosses some water on her, although instead of melting, she just kind of fades away like a Final Fantasy boss. So here's a bit of film history that's relevant to our topic for this video. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was mainly produced by the Selig Polyscape Company, a fairly prominent one at the time as they produced a lot of films in the first few decades of the 1900s. The reason Selig Polyscape in particular even made this film at all was for the sake of contractual obligation, and because of this multiple films would be produced by this same company, all set in the Oz universe. However, despite the fact that these films were fully made, and despite the fact that we know they did indeed exist, the remaining 3 Oz films made by Selig Polyscape are considered to be lost films, as far as we know, not a single copy exists today. Instead, all we can really do is go off of the catalog descriptions printed at the time, giving us a very rough idea of what the films were about. But when it comes to these early interpretations of The Wizard of Oz, there's actually another production company that's of any significance, that being the Oz Manufacturing Company, founded by L. Frank Baum himself in 1914. Now, the history of the Oz Manufacturing Company is actually a rather short one, as despite it managing to develop a grand total of 10 films, the studio was forced to close the following year due to a lack of financial success. Despite this, in the case of uncovering the early era of Wizard of Oz films, the Oz Manufacturing Company remains quite significant, as 3 of the projects it worked on were based on the Oz series and are still available to watch today, albeit with a few missing fragments of each film. Now, in terms of these films, it should be noted that they don't actually retell the events of the original book for the millionth time, as they instead choose to take inspiration from the sequel novels written in the intervening years. Specifically, the material adapted here includes The Patchwork Girl of Oz, Queen Zixie of Ix, and The Scarecrow of Oz. Although, in the case of that third one, it's actually the opposite, as the movie would end up influencing the book, which was written later. As you'd probably expect, these 3 films aren't really sequels necessarily to the 1910 film, but rather different stories with different characters that still take place in Oz, or in the case of Scarecrow of Oz, another drastically altered version of the original story. Now, from a retrospective outlook, this trio of films becomes rather significant in the overall history of Oz films, as oddly enough, these would be the last films to adapt anything other than the original book for quite some time, as for the next few decades, any attempt at bringing the world of Oz to the silver screen would almost exclusively adapt that first book, or at the very least use it as a basis for whatever story the movie wants to tell. This includes a 1925 silent film adaptation, which makes quite a few changes to the source material, such as turning Dorothy into the long-lost ruler of Oz, who must reclaim the throne from the evil Prime Minister Cruel. And then we have the Canadian-American 1933 short film, which gives us an animated version of the story for the first time, which, in broad strokes, stays somewhat faithful to the book. Okay, so originally I was just going to gloss over this animated film because honestly I didn't have much to say about it, but I kind of just want to talk about it a bit more here because this is a weird cartoon, man. I mean, it is still a basic interpretation of Wizard of Oz, but like most of it is just everybody screwing around, you know what I mean? Like, I'm not kidding here, there's like a full 40-second segment towards the middle here where Dorothy and the others just like watch animals have sex. Like, obviously they're not showing it on screen, but the implication is, like, really obvious. The wizard in this version is, like, an actual wizard this time, and the last third of this cartoon is just everybody running around like crazy people. Like, it just turns into a Tom and Jerry bit, and then it just stops. Like, we don't even see if Dorothy makes it back to Kansas. It's so bizarre. This, of course, brings us up to the year 1939, and the release of the adaptation everybody is familiar with. Having watched all the adaptations of The Wizard of Oz up to this point, it's pretty easy to see why this is the version that became so well known, while every other attempt has essentially fallen to the wayside. Mainly, it's the first film in this series of adaptations that I can say still holds up under a modern lens, and like, really well. Even despite its age, I would hesitate to call it a dated film because it still has such a nice look to it. There's this specific dreamlike quality to the film, presenting Oz in a manner that previous attempts simply failed to do for one reason or another. You could argue that it has such a unique vibe to it that no one has managed to replicate since then. No film ever really looked like this before. I think part of the reason why the film works so well is in the fact that, to me at least, it takes a lot of cues from the franchise's history with the theater. Like, you see all these large, extravagant sets, and you can't help but see the movie as more of a really high-budget stage show. Again, given this series' history with theater, it's a fairly appropriate comparison. What I'm getting at here is that by comparing every version of The Wizard of Oz up to this point, it doesn't take a genius to see why this one in particular is the one we still remember so fondly so long after its initial release. It's easy to see why this is one of the most famous movies of all time. Just, you know, don't look up the production history of this film because holy hell is that a story in itself. Now, something I think is rather interesting about The Wizard of Oz is the fact that despite how many books in the Oz series there are, and despite how acclaimed the film was at the time, a sequel was never really on the table post-release. At the same time, though, you need to keep in mind that, despite the positive reception, the 1939 film was actually a bit of a box office disappointment, making a sequel a hard sell in the first place. Plus, to be fair, this was a very different time, when film studios weren't quite as obsessed with sequels and continuations like we are now. Movie sequels as a concept did exist, of course, but for the most part, movies were one-and-done projects, and the same holds true here. That is not to say that sequels to The Wizard of Oz don't exist, however, because, oh boy, is that far from the case. Multiple times have studios attempted to continue the story of the world of Oz, and given that there's plenty of material to pick from, the quality of these attempts tend to vary, so let's talk about some of them. Typically, when people think Wizard of Oz sequel, it's likely that the first thing that's going to come to their mind is Return to Oz, the 1985 film produced by Disney. Since Disney had purchased the film rights to the franchise at the time, I guess it only made sense to capitalize on it with a proper film. Return to Oz mainly takes elements from the second and third books in the series. In the movie, Dorothy finds herself returning to Oz after she's caught outside in a storm. Upon arrival, Dorothy finds the world in complete devastation, having been torn apart by a creature called the Gnome King. Dorothy teams up with a new cast of characters and ventures to where the Gnome King resides to put things right again. Now, the big factor as to why everyone remembers Return to Oz is for one simple reason: the fact that the film is significantly darker than the movie it's acting as a sequel to. And indeed, the film does get pretty wild with the stuff it shows off. To be honest though, when people refer to the movie as being outright scary, I think they're being just a tad hyperbolic. Like, the film is definitely darker than the original, but I don't think it's nearly as scary as its reputation would suggest. Then again though, I'm 25 and not 7, so maybe it's just a perspective thing. The big thing that stands out to me about Return to Oz is actually the Land of Oz itself. For being advertised as a sequel to The Wizard of Oz, the world presented here looks significantly different than the one presented in the 1939 film. It's a far more natural land, lacking much of that dreamlike fairy tale whimsy that the first one had. But I think there is a good reason for this. Return to Oz is always described as being the sequel to The Wizard of Oz, and while that is technically true, in reality it makes far more sense to see the film as a sequel to the book, rather than the film. I mean, really think about it. All the characters from the first book, the Scarecrow, Tin Man, and the rest, when you look at them, they all resemble their book illustrations far more than they do in the 39 film. The same goes for the world. There's such a difference between films that it's almost like they aren't trying to be consistent with the world from the first one. And if you need more proof, there are points where Dorothy will even reference places and events from her first trip to Oz, specifically places and events that straight up did not happen in the movie. Return to Oz is so intriguing to me because I really don't think it should be viewed as a proper sequel to The Wizard of Oz. You really have to view it as its own thing. I think when it comes to trying to make a continuation of the Oz story, the easy route is to just take the pre-existing characters and just focus on them, instead of trying to develop wholly new characters. But what's interesting is that, when it comes to the original book series, it's kind of half and half in this regard. Like, taking into account all 40 canon books, it's fairly surprising how many times the series switches between bringing back old characters and focusing on totally new ones. The movies are kind of the same in this regard, as while many of them do bring back Dorothy and her friends, there are also plenty that just decide to tell a completely different story, and those to me are the more interesting films, one of the earliest in this category being The Wonderful Land of Oz, a low-budget film released in 1969. So this film is based off of the second book in the famous 40, and when I say that this film is low budget, I really mean low budget. From what I gather, the film had a budget of a paltry $50,000, which in today's money is roughly $445,000. The lack of a substantial budget is very evident in just how the film looks, but it's even more evident when you factor in what went on behind the scenes to get the film made. To save money, the actors cast for the film were relatively unknown, and therefore very cheap to hire. I mean, for crying out loud, the main character was played by the director's 10-year-old son. Now, of course, I'm not saying a movie made on the cheap can't still be good. Good acting and decent enough directing can still make for a good product. It's just too bad that this film doesn't have either of those. Okay, I don't want to be too mean here. Clearly, there's some effort that was put into this project, but regardless of what you or I might think about it, Wonderful Land of Oz has garnered a bit of a reputation within the Wizard of Oz fandom as being one of the poorer attempts at adapting a story in the series. To me, this film feels like someone videotaping a high school play. You know what I mean? Like, you got the sets that are obviously made out of paint and wood, you got the people who just aren't that good at acting but are trying their best. As someone who did high school theater themselves, this one kinda hit me with that same vibe. Before we move on, something I want to touch on are the more modern films that fall within this category. With all of our fancy modern day movie techniques, how do filmmakers attempt to create a Wizard of Oz sequel? I went ahead and looked up some of the more recent Oz movies, as in the last decade or so, just to see what we had regarding possible sequels, and what I found are a handful of animated movies, so let's take a quick look at a couple of these. Okay, so one of the more notable is the 2014 film Legend of Oz: Dorothy's Return. So this film is actually based on the 1989 book Dorothy of Oz, which, believe it or not, was written by the great-grandson of L. Frank Baum, Roger S. Baum. As far as I can tell, though, Dorothy of Oz doesn't count towards the actual canonical books, making it kind of an Elseworld-style story, to put it one way. Like Return to Oz, this film acts more like a direct sequel to the first movie, as the plot involves Dorothy returning to Oz and reuniting with the characters from her first adventure. Total transparency here, I didn't end up having that much to say about this one, or at least not as much as I wanted to, because really, it's just kind of your bog standard Oz sequel. Like, at least with Return to Oz, the amount of differences, both tonally and visually, make it very intriguing to compare with the film it's trying to act as a continuation of. Here, though, I don't know, it's just another Wizard of Oz movie. Like, there's nothing that particularly stands out about it other than that fact. Legend of Oz is kinda infamous within the Wizard of Oz fandom for being a not very good film. It was a box office bomb on its release, and in fact was so much of a failure that it forced the company who made it, Summertime Films, to effectively shut down. Pretty embarrassing, considering that was the only film they ever made. The only other movie here I think is worth mentioning in this segment is The Steam Engines of Oz, as it is, at this point in time, the most recent film to try and continue the story of the 1939 film. So this 2018 film is apparently based off of a similarly titled comic series which had come out a few years prior. The movie takes place about 100 years after the original film, with the land of Oz having undergone their own industrial revolution, with the Emerald City having become more modernized. The Tin Man has become some kind of, dictator, and his continuous expansion of the Emerald City through the use of machines is causing Oz to lose its magic. As such, it's up to a new cast of characters to find a way to stop him. Now, the first thing that came to mind when I saw this film's animation was, well, it's good to know that the guy who made Elisa is still getting work. Okay, maybe that's a bit mean, but the fact that this is a low-budget film is pretty obvious just going off of the animation. At the very least, I think the setting itself is enough to make this movie stand out on its own, compared to everything else we've seen. It is trying something new, the idea of taking this largely fantasy setting and adding a more steampunk element to it. It gives it its own identity. Just for the hell of it, I decided to give the comic the movie is based on a quick read, and it's not that bad. Seriously, if the concept of a steampunk Wizard of Oz intrigues you at all, give the comic a try. So far in this video, we've talked about movies before the big famous 1939 classic, as well as all the films that tried to continue the story afterwards. However, there's one more category of Oz films that I think is worth mentioning, those being the ones that, while still clearly classified as Wizard of Oz films, are more so doing their own thing. Not spin-offs necessarily, just supplementary material. Now, the big one that everyone immediately thinks of when it comes to additional Oz media is Wicked. First premiering in 2003 and based on the similarly titled book, Wicked, for those who aren't aware, gives us an alternative perspective of the story, putting our focus on the Wicked Witch of the West and telling us her side of the narrative, taking place before, during, and after the original tale. Wicked essentially recontextualizes what we know about the original Wizard of Oz story, making the Wicked Witch a far more sympathetic character while attempting to explain why certain things and characters appear the way they do. Basically going the Rogue One and Solo route of trying to explain every little thing, you know what I mean? For the longest time, Wicked was primarily known as just the musical, and one that proved to be very popular. Like seriously, it's one of the highest grossing musical productions of all time, that's how popular it is. Nowadays, though, if you want to experience Wicked in a simpler format, we have the duology of films that were released a little while back. I haven't seen them for myself, admittedly, but people seem to like them, so there you go. Despite its popularity, though, I think it is worth pointing out that, like basically every Oz sequel we've looked at, Wicked is considered non-canon to the original movie. Or, to be more accurate, The Wizard of Oz is canon to Wicked, whereas Wicked is not canon to The Wizard of Oz, if that makes sense. Most people consider Wicked primarily as a prequel, but for me personally, I wouldn't really consider it as such necessarily. To me, I see it as more of a reinterpretation, if anything. And speaking of reinterpretations, there's one Wizard of Oz adjacent film like Wicked that doesn't get quite as much attention, but is still worth mentioning in this discussion. That being The Wiz. Beginning life as a 1974 musical, The Wiz is, in essence, the original Wizard of Oz story, but reframed in the context of then-current African-American culture. As such, the characters of the musical are meant to be represented with an all-black cast. By and large, the actual plot of the musical is fairly similar to the original, so by now I think you can probably imagine how that goes. However, the version of The Wiz I want to mention here is actually the 1978 film interpretation of the musical. Now, the reason I mention the movie version isn't just because it's the version you likely think of when The Wiz is mentioned at all, but also for the fact that the film does actually make quite a few story changes from the musical it's based off of. For example, instead of being a young girl from a Kansas farm, Dorothy in this story is a school teacher from Harlem, New York. The biggest change, though, is the presentation of the Land of Oz. Instead of being this colorful, dreamlike fairy tale world, Oz in the movie version of The Wiz is, for the most part, just a bunch of dark, almost apocalyptic-looking set pieces that remind me way too much of that city from the 90s Mario movie. Also, the Scarecrow here is played by Michael Jackson. I wanted to mention that, but didn't really know how to bring it up naturally, but yeah, that's a thing. Personally, I don't have much more to say about The Wiz. It is still important, though, and I'd be remiss to not bring it up at some point in this whole discussion. Okay, let's see, what else have we got here? Yellow Brick Road? Oh, okay, so they made Wizard of Oz into a horror movie. Interesting choice, I guess. Is this from the same people who made those Winnie the Pooh horror movies? You know they're making this whole, cinematic universe on, horror movie versions of Disney movies? Who was asking for that? I'm getting off topic here. Okay, I'm going to be completely honest here. There were a lot of movies here that I could have talked about, but for the sake of not making this an hour-long video, I've decided against really getting into most of these. I mean, for crying out loud here, there are just so frickin' many Wizard of Oz movies that it's kinda crazy how many times this story has been rehashed. From sequels to reimaginings to crossovers, the amount of revisits we've made to the Land of Oz makes for quite a long list. So much so that I ended up getting kinda burnt out after a while. At the same time, though, it really stands as a testament to how classic and beloved that original film is that we've had so many different variations over the decades. If I've piqued your interest at all, this is a topic I recommend looking into yourself. Despite all I've covered here today, there is still a plethora of stuff I didn't even mention. This is a deep rabbit hole of a subject, so who knows, maybe I'll end up revisiting it someday. Regardless, while The Wizard of Oz is far from the most adapted story of all time, the fact that it has been given so many different interpretations is something worth paying attention to. If anything, it not only shows how beloved the world of Oz is to so many, it also demonstrates how malleable of a world it is, with a multitude of different styles and directions people have taken it in. No matter the quality of many of these projects, it proves that The Wizard of Oz is a classic story that still inspires people more than a century after its initial publication. I mean, after all, there's a reason people consider this to be the first great American fairy tale. But I mean, come on. We all know that the best adaptation is Muppets' Wizard of Oz. You know, the one that has Quentin Tarantino in it for some reason.
Piggy transforming into Gonzo, mutating into Scooter, Scooter turning into a big, busty vampire vixen who explodes in a sea of crimson blood.